this video, we're going to continue our study of lines, but instead of graphing those lines, we're going to look at how can I cut these lines into equal sections, sometimes in half, and later on into pieces like 3, 4, or 5 pieces. And where would those points fall in the line that would do that equal cutting? So the first thing we're going to look at is something called midpoint. So when we look at midpoint, we're trying to just find the middle point of the line. So to find the midpoint, we're going to find an ordered pair that gives us the average of the x values and the average of the y values. So thinking about this, let's look at the equation for midpoint. This is the equation for midpoint. So if you think about an average, that's where you take any number of numbers and add together, divide by how many numbers you added up. If we're just talking about a point in between two other points, all we're going to do is take that one x value from the first point, add it to the other x value of the second point, and then because we're adding two things, we're going to divide it by 2. Then we're going to do the same thing with the y values. Add them together and divide by 2. So let's take a look at a quick example of that. So find the midpoint of 3, 7 and -2, 4. So this is simple enough. All we have to do is add those pieces together. So we'll do 3, our first x value, plus -2, our second x value, divided by 2. Then we're going to do the same for the y values. 7 plus 4, those are our two y values, divided by 2. Now we simplify this. 3 plus -2, 1 over 2, and 7 plus 4 is 11 over 2. Now we can simplify that to 0.5, comma 5.5. Now once I get an answer, I always like to make sure that that answer makes sense. So a quick, easy way to do that for these problems is to draw a quick graph. So what we're going to do to draw the graph is just plot the 3 points, your 2 endpoints and the midpoint. So we plot our first endpoint at 3, 7, like I have there. Then we're going to plot our next endpoint at -2, 4, so about there. And then finally the midpoint would be at 0.5 and 5.5, so a rough estimation about there. Now if we take a closer look, we can see that those 2 endpoints and our midpoint, if we look at them, we can tell that point in the middle is definitely in the middle of those 2 points. Alright, let's take a look at a second example. So our second example is 5, -2, and 6, 14. So what we're going to do first is add up our x values, divide by 2, add up our y values, divide by 2. So 5 plus 6, divided by 2, and then -2 plus 14, divided by 2. From here, we can combine those top numbers. 5 plus 6 is 11 over 2, and -2 plus 14 is 12 over 2. We can simplify that to be 5.5, comma 6. So that is our midpoint. And again, we can draw a rough graph sketch of the situation. So we'll go our first endpoint, 5, -2. Our second endpoint, 6, 14. So way up there. And then our midpoint, 5.56. And if you look at those points, you can tell that that 5.56 is definitely in the middle of those 2 endpoints. Let's get some practice finding midpoints. A couple more here just real quick. So we're going to do 3 plus 14 divided by 2, and -9 plus 16 divided by 2. And we simplify those. 3 plus 14 is 17 over 2. -9 plus 16 is 7 over 2. Simplify that one step further. 17 divided by 2, that's going to give us 8.5. And then 7 divided by 2, 3.5. Alright, go ahead and pause the video and try the next problem, see if you can do it, and then we'll come back and I'll show you the answer. Okay, so the answer to this one would be 2.5, 13. That would be the point on the graph that is in the middle of those 2 points. All right, let's look at this another way. What if, instead of giving the 2 endpoints to find the midpoint, what if we wanted to find the other endpoint given the actual midpoint and one of the endpoints? So let's take a look at that. So keep in mind what we're doing is we're given one endpoint, we're given the midpoint, and we want to find the other endpoint. So there, like that. So this is how we kind of look algebraically. Let's take a look at that. We know that our equation for midpoint is x1 plus x2 over 2, comma y1 plus y2 over 2 equals some point x comma y, and that some point is our midpoint. So we plug our numbers into this equation, we'll get something like this. This endpoint, let's call it x1, y1, because it's the initial point, and then we want to find the other endpoint, x2, y2. So if we substitute in, we end up getting something like 7 plus, we don't know, x2 over 2. That's going to give us our x value. And then negative 3 plus y2 over 2, that's going to give us our y value. So what we got here now is 2 equations that we have to solve. So in the first equation, let's solve for x2 here. Oh, we know x is our midpoint value of 3, and we know y is our midpoint value of negative 6. Now we're going to solve this equation for x2. So the way we do that is we multiply both sides by 2 since we're dividing by 2. There's 7 plus x2, those 2's cancel, and 3 times 2 is 6. And then we just subtract the 7, so x2 is negative 1. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing for y2. Multiply both sides by 2, get negative 3 plus y2 is equal to negative 12. And then add 3 to both sides, so we get y2 is negative 9. So that is our ordered pair, in which we get negative 1, comma, negative 9. That's our ordered pair there. Alright, now that's one way to do it. Let me show you what I think is a simpler way. So I'm going to write this out. I have an endpoint. I know it's 7, negative 3. Then I have a midpoint, which I know is 3, negative 6. And then I have a final endpoint, which I don't know yet. That's what I'm solving for. So I know that a midpoint is directly in the middle of my 2 endpoints. So my thought is, if I can find out how can I get from 7 to the midpoint, 3, then if I do that again, that'll get me to the other endpoint, because the distance between both endpoints should be the same. So 7 to 3, that's subtracting 4. So if I subtract 4 again from 3, it gives me negative 1. And I'll do the same thing for my y. From negative 3 to negative 6, I have to subtract 3 to do that. So that means to get to my other endpoint, I have to subtract 3 again, and that gives me negative 9. Hey look, that's the same value I got from doing all this algebra over here. So it doesn't matter which way you do the problem, you're going to get the same answer. I just find the second method is a little simpler to follow along with when you're solving for a missing endpoint. Alright, let's take a look at another example of this just to make sure we really got it. So again, I'm going to do my shortcut method where I start with an endpoint, I go to the midpoint, and then I'm finding the endpoint. So my initial endpoint is 3, 0. I'm going to the midpoint of negative 1, 2, and then I'm repeating that distance to get to my endpoint. So our x's, to get from 3 to negative 1, I have to subtract 4. And then to repeat that to get to another endpoint, negative 1 minus 4 is negative 5. Do the same thing for my y. 0 to 2 is adding 2, so I have to add 2 here to get 4. So that means my answer is negative 5, 4. like to do is just kind of in my mind more often than not. You can also just graph it. Plot these points. You plot the point 3, 0, so somewhere about there. That's my first endpoint. My midpoint is -1, +2, so somewhere around here, -1, +2. And then it says -5, +4. So somewhere around there. If you look, that's kind of in the middle. Again, this is a rough sketch, so can't be exact, but it kind of looks like it would make sense for that to be the middle point. So it's a good way to just do a quick check of yourself. All right, I want you guys to take a quick minute, try this problem out. Go ahead, pause the video, try it out, and when you get back, we'll go over the answer. All right, so for the final endpoint, what I got was -10, 11. See if that's what you got as well.